Welcome to your iconic image. If you want to take control of your image and be a power player in your space, then this is the show for you. Here we will arm you with tools and information to help you grow your brand on purpose. I'm your host, Marlana Semenza, photographer and visual strategist. Now let's dive into today's episode. Dr. Yishai is a psychologist, business consultant, and executive coach who helps us master how to react powerfully, which is so important. Every single conversation that I have ever had with him, he brings such incredible insight. So I am thrilled to have you here. Welcome, Yishai.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm likewise really excited to have this conversation today.
Me too, because, I think no matter where we are in our journey, we all suffer from this at some point, and sometimes multiple points. So first of all, tell us, where exactly does imposter syndrome come from?
It's a great question. So I'm going to do a little psychology history lesson a bit, and then we'll do it on the personal level also, because I think the personal level is a really important one. So the first time imposter syndrome was described, it was actually called, and it's often still called in research, imposter phenomenon. Now I know that sounds really different. I kind of like that better, because rather than it being some kind of a disease that you have that's now stuck to you, it's something that we experience as a phenomenon. And it was initially really kind of described in the 70s by two psychologists, Suzanne Imes and Pauline Clance. So one of the interesting things that came along with that, because they were psychologists who were working with patients, and they found that, especially among really high achievers, they started to notice this pattern of certain people would really struggle to internalize and accept their own success and view themselves as being able to be successful. And then they would be constantly pushing themselves to think about what they want or what they expect to achieve. And then they'd be looking at themselves kind of backwards through a telescope. And if you've ever done that, you know that whatever you look at looks really small when you look backwards through that telescope or through binoculars. And that's kind of how people can view themselves. And I find that to be a really fascinating way of kind of constructing an understanding. And I think that really touches on the personal piece of it. So oftentimes whether it's we're starting something new or we're in something, but what we keep looking at is something that's 2 or 3 kind of dreams or goals or levels higher than where we're currently at, then it's easy to kind of turn that telescope, turn those binoculars around, and then view myself as being this, who am I, this tiny little, person, an imposter. And then there's a lot of emotions that come with that. And I think a lot of us, we tend to make meaning of those emotions. So if I'm afraid people are going to look at me and see the same thing I see when I invert the telescope, then I'm going to feel afraid of being revealed. I might experience shame or embarrassment, even in anticipation of that. And it's also possible that I can view myself as being incompetent because I'm not able to do the thing that I dream or want or desire or I'm hoping to accomplish. I'm not already there.
Mm-hmm. So it also sounds a little bit like, and I've thought this along the way, that whole idea of fake it till you make it actually plays right into imposter syndrome, because if you're constantly faking it, then you are in fact an imposter.
Yeah, I actually think that thought really drives the narrative or the story that I'm an imposter. I happen to believe and view it differently. I mean, there's actually a lot of research on this. So I don't know if you've heard of the book Mindset by Carol Dweck.
Mm-mm.
So she has talked about this. She's done a ton of research on this. She talks about 2 different mindsets, a fixed versus a growth mindset. And the whole book really shows so much of her research in a lot of these different domains. Really briefly, a fixed mindset views people as either having a talent or a capability, or they don't have it. So it's kind of something it's viewed like either you genetically were born with it, or there's just no way you can have it. That's kind of a fixed mindset where there isn't really space to grow. It isn't about a growth process, but rather it's that either you got it or you don't. And then in that way of thinking, at any given moment, if I am being that way, then I've got it. And if I'm not being that way, well, then I must be categorized as though I don't have it. So the concept of fake it till you make it really kind of puts you in that view of, well, either you got it or you don't. and
Hmm.
you're supposed to keep faking it, keep faking it, keep faking it, and then somehow magically one day you'll just have it. And that doesn't, first of all, it doesn't really kind of logically, it doesn't really compute for me at least,
Right.
especially since being a psychologist and having a background in understanding both developmental and counseling and clinical psychology. Like, if I didn't believe people can change over time, then what would I be doing all day? Helping people try and change, change how they see themselves, change how they are in the world, change parts of their lives or themselves or the way that they think or feel, um, or how they respond to those thoughts and feelings, right? If I didn't believe that we could change over time, then yeah, we would all just be stuck. But if we couldn't change over time, we'd be born either walking and talking, or we'd never be able to walk and talk. So, I mean, in the book, it isn't quite that, I'll say, black and white. There are things about a fixed mindset that are perhaps useful or important. There are, I'm sure, use cases for it. The other side of that, the growth mindset, is a view that we are all constantly in growth.
Hmm.
So we are all constantly in development, which means if today I'm not able to do something, does that mean I will never be able to do it? Well, no. Of course, I can perhaps eventually do that. It might take a lot of work, a lot of effort. It might take consistent effort over a prolonged period of time. I can grow my way into things. So that growth mindset really views it, takes the view that effort and time and energy are more important and will help you get there. And so a lot of people, when we think about fake it till you make it, it's a very fixed mindset. It's like, well, you need to act and show other people that you are that way, because if you don't do that, then people will assume you're not. And then but then you are aware that you're trying to act that way as opposed to being that way. And if you've ever tried to fake anything in front of people who really know and understand what it's like to either be there or not, uh, or who have been through that process, they'll look at you and be like, uh, oh, honey,
Yeah.
oh, you're no, just don't.
Yeah. And it's the fastest way to ruin your credibility.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. It's a real turnoff for someone who has done the work, who has been in a place where they've needed to develop and they've come through it to another place, right? The people that it appeals to are other people who are often
Mm.
perhaps also having that same thought process. Oh yeah, I need to look and sound like I'm a professional, and then people will treat me like a professional. Um, it actually reminds me that in the research, another thing that really shows up a lot is that, in contrast, they did some research where they compared students versus professionals, particularly in places like medicine and psychology. And what they found was imposter syndrome was a lot more common among the students than it was among the professionals.
Hmm.
So for people who are, and thing about being a student is, being a student is about being under development. We're at a phase, right? And I was a student. I mean, I will consider myself a student for life, even though I've kind of come through that graduate school process, got my doctorate, right? When when I was a student, I was in a phase where I was under development, under a lot of development. I mean, I was taking tons of courses, having supervision, seeing patients, still learning what I'm doing, and doing the best that I could. And so, on the one hand, from a fixed mindset, am I a professional? No. I'm trying to be, or at the time, really learn to become. But on the other hand, am I under development? Am I growing? Will I become a professional? Absolutely. So it's just interesting to think about it, because in the research, students are much more likely to have that. They're also much more under development. And if they view themselves as in a very binary way, like either I am a professional or I'm not, well, then they're going to experience a tremendous amount of imposter syndrome.
So, for those of us that would consider ourselves professionals that suffer from it, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think it's a few different pieces of it. The first part is to just slow down and become aware of the thoughts and the feelings and the reactions that we're having. Meaning, I think for people who are professionals, it will show up in moments, not necessarily all the time. I mean, if it's showing up all the time, that's something else that's worth paying closer attention to and recognizing. For many people, it shows up at a moment where perhaps we made a mistake, or we're trying or embarking on a new aspect or element of our own, whether it's our professional development or in our own business or in the next stage that we want to kind of step up or step into. Then, yeah, of course, on the one hand, it's important to recognize that I might not be totally competent at what I'm about to do. And the imposter syndrome might be pointing out to me that, hey, you're not an expert in this yet. And I think a lot of it is how we process and respond to that. So one part of it is, from my viewpoint, is to slow down and recognize that. Notice what that feeling is. Notice what the thoughts are that show up. Because I think a lot of times when we don't feel competent, or when we feel less competent or even incompetent, we have this tendency sometimes to make meaning out of that. And the meaning we sometimes make is, I am a fraud, or I am a failure, or I will be a failure, or I will be a fraud, or I will be known to become a fraud. And all of that meaning making is that really accurate?
Mm.
Is that about reality? I think it's important to slow down and take a bit of a reality check and ask yourself, are you there yet? Maybe not. Do you have to be? Maybe not. What if it could be a learning process? What if, just like learning to walk and talk and do math and do the profession that you're in, you can learn whatever that next step is? In fact, on my phone, the background of my phone is, it's an open book, and the text above it says, learn your way into it.
Love that.
And I do that as a constant reminder because, yeah, especially when I was embarking on this journey that I've been on, and I'm continuing to embark and move in other directions, and so many of them are foreign, and there's just so much to learn. Before that, I needed to learn my way into it.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as working with it, one is becoming aware, acknowledging. Another part of it is just taking a moment to pause and just register what those thoughts are and ask yourself, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to do for you? What do they want for you? Those are the questions I really love to ask, especially when I'm coaching. Is imagine that those thoughts are feelings. Well, depending on the environment, if I'm coaching or in therapy, it's going to look different. But imagine that those thoughts or feelings are trying to help you. What is it that they want for you? What's the end result they would hope for you? And I've had people, of course, say, oh, they just want to bring me down. Well, do they really? Are they telling you that they don't want you to be good at something and they want you to just abandon everything? Is that what your thoughts really want for you? Perhaps they want you to get better.
Hmm.
Perhaps they want you to become that expert. They're pointing out that you're not. Does that mean that you need to get stuck in that place? Not necessarily. You can recognize what those are. I think it could be really productive to even ask yourself, okay, brain, okay, thoughts, okay, my mind, what is it that I can do if you really want me to become competent and really capable and feel like I know what I'm doing and I can do it well? Okay, help me figure out how to get there. Now, that, from my viewpoint, is actually harnessing that, because your imposter syndrome wants you to be competent, wants you to be an expert, wants you to be at that place that you would like to achieve. You're a high achiever. You want to step up. You want to step into the uncomfortable zone. You want to step into the arena. You want to level up. Okay, it wants all of those things for you. And it happens to be doing that in a way of saying, and pointing out, maybe jabbing at you and saying, hey, you're not there yet. Okay, well, then help me get there.
Love all of that. Um, so is there anything that we can do when we're experiencing this to kind of retrain our brain to shift into a different gear?
Yeah, one thing I think that's really important. If you want, I can give you a couple of daily practices and then some things you can do in the moment. One daily practice, which I think is so great, is either once or even twice a day. Ask yourself what you've accomplished. Most of us, especially those of us who experience imposter syndrome frequently, we rarely pause to take in and savor our accomplishments. We tend to dismiss them. Sometimes I say we miss or dismiss them. So we just move on really quickly. And again, what that brings back, it evokes that concept or that analogy of the inverted telescope.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I don't pause and look at my accomplishments, what view do I have of myself? Right? Is my view of myself really proportionate? Is it like the, I don't know if you've ever been in like a hall of mirrors where there's like one mirror that shows you yourself, but then there are other ones that show you like distorted, too big, much bigger, much smaller, right?
Um,
So that that process, that practice of asking yourself, what are some things I've accomplished today? And they can be small things. Maybe it's today I did my laundry and I called up one person. I called up one client. Maybe it's I got two of, my KPIs out of five things that I'd wanted to get done, my key performance indicators, or, my outcomes that I really want. I got two of them out of five done. Well, I think for a lot of people, it's easy to focus on the three because you still have to or want to do them
mhm.
in order to get towards your goal. How about taking the time to recognize and acknowledge the two that you have done? And if you're consistently doing two, then what if that's great? What if that's good enough? Or I'll put it even differently. If you are a learning, growing person, then you're not going to be able to just pick up five things and do them at once. But you can pick up one or maybe two. And if you focus on those things and accomplish them and focus on how to develop your skill and grow in doing that, then you're going to increase your ability to do them. And then guess what? You have now a little bit more space because you've become more adept at doing that. You have a little bit more mental space, energy, and time to pick up the other ones. And so even if you have five things, just focusing on one or two or acknowledging that that is good enough or that you're making accomplishments, right? And so taking that time, coming back, taking that time to ask myself, what is or what are the accomplishments that I have today? And it's useful to pick a number of them. And again, sometimes it's just getting through my day and feeding myself and putting myself to bed. That can be an accomplishment, especially when there might be so much going on. It really can depend on the circumstance, but giving yourself credit for those, I think, is a really big part of it, so that you have an accurate reflection and you're not looking at this kind of hall of mirrors distorted or inverted telescope, because it can become really easy. And I think many of us, because we're so much on autopilot and again, constantly looking at the next thing, the next accomplishment, right? What can I achieve next? Or we're comparing ourselves to the biggest, most well-known people in the field or in the profession, right? It's easy to then invert that telescope. So one way to turn that back around is to really take a look at what it is that we are doing.
Love that. And I think it's so important too, because so many of us are so focused on the next thing that we forget, even when we're driving in a car, that there's also a rear view mirror for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me ask you, what about comparison? How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, I mentioned it before. So there's a lot of interesting research on comparison. Comparison is a fascinating part of the way our brains very frequently work, in that we often are comparing. And there is a use case for comparison. I think comparison has a lot of benefits in a certain context.
Which, it's interesting that you say that, because that was going to be the follow-up question that I had, is there good comparison versus not good comparison?
It's interesting because I don't think about good versus not good or good versus bad. I think about use cases and I think about the end result of those things. So we'll kind of talk about that, maybe even back our way into that.
Okay.
So the first thing to recognize is there's a difference between upward and downward comparison. It's what it's called in research. So if I compare myself to somebody who's accomplished more than I have, then I'm making an upward comparison. I'm looking at myself and then I'm looking at somebody else who's accomplished something more than I have. However, very frequently, those comparisons are really unidimensional, in that they pick one thing that someone has done that I haven't yet, and they kind of ignore everything else or many other things. Sometimes what people will do is they'll throw in something else that would justify or lead me to imagine that I could or should have already accomplished this thing that the other person has. So it's some of the favorites that I have is somebody who, let's say they want to write a book, and then they compare themselves to somebody who's published 15 bestsellers. We talk about an upwards comparison, right? So how are they likely to feel about themselves?
Not very
And
good.
not particularly great, right? And it's easier to feel like, well, who am I to put this book together? And I'm not even a bestseller, and I'm going to try to sell this book. It's very easy to start having that kind of self-doubting thought process. And frequently, when we make upward comparisons, we tend to feel less about ourselves. We might even doubt ourselves. Whereas making downward comparisons can help us sometimes feel better about ourselves, though there are also downsides, as it turns out, to that. If I'm constantly looking at people who haven't accomplished as much as me, then I might feel pretty good about my accomplishments, but I also might not be thinking about where can I go next or what does that next step look like. So I think there are upsides and downsides. I think as far as comparison goes, though, the use case for comparison, which I'm going to get very nerdy and talk about statistics for a moment, not too much in depth, but the use case for comparison is if I want to look at whether it's two groups or two people and say, let's hold all things equal and see one person does this thing or gets, whether it's a treatment, like a medical treatment, or they make a choice and the other person doesn't do that or does something different. What is the outcome of that? So comparison is useful if you can control or remove all these other factors and look at one choice, one event, one treatment, or one response, and see what is the result of that. So the use case for comparison and the reason that that's useful, and in statistics, there are all different kinds of statistics that do that. They compare different groups. That's a very common statistic that's used. The reason to do that is to learn about what choices or actions or responses might help you the next time you're in a situation just like that.
Mm.
That's a pretty narrow context, though.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm, however, making comparisons to somebody who's twice my age, which means they've had 30 plus more adult years of life, and they have made all these accomplishments, but they've also spent more than twice the amount of time that I have on getting to those accomplishments. And I look at them and I say, look, they accomplished this. Who am I? Well, I'm really not accounting for very much. I'm not really doing that use case for comparison where I'm holding all the other things equal or removing them as factors and then saying, is this response useful or not useful? Right. So it's kind of outside that really helpful use case. And then what that tends to do is lead me to say, oh gosh, I'll never be there, or, you know, or to have these kinds of thoughts and processes going in my brain. What if I never get there? How could I possibly get there? I mean, that person's just so great. And there are times where people are like, oh, at 30, they were already doing this, or, you know, that's the other situation is someone will go to like the Forbes or whatever list there is, like 30 under 30, top,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, 30 under 30, or they'll just kind of like cherry pick and they'll say that, and this is like taking that top 1% and then making that comparison. Again, outside the use case, the helpful use case of comparison to say, let me look at the highest achiever in this one area and compare myself to that. And then we also have this tendency to do it with multiple people in multiple arenas all at once. So that's kind of like, can you imagine watching the Olympics and comparing yourself to the gold medal winner in every different sport and then looking at yourself? I mean, how are we all going to think about ourselves? If any one of those gold medal winners did the same thing, they would feel terrible.
Yeah.
Most likely, right? They would look at themselves and say, look at what all these other people are capable of. And all I did was just one thing, right? And we have this tendency to just have our comparisons multiply and multiply, and we're making a lot of upward comparisons. And I think it's very important to be extremely cautious and acknowledge and recognize when we are making a comparison, what we are trying to do, which I think, again, a lot of it comes back to this question of what is that trying to do for you? What does it want for you? So what does the comparison want for me? Well, I think at least the way I'm currently thinking about it, may be twofold. The comparison, first of all, wants me to reach for something higher, something bigger, something better. It wants me to accomplish, to become, to embody, to do, right? To make a greater impact, or to be seen in another way, or in a bigger way, or to see others, to help others in a bigger way, right? So that's the first thing. The comparison says, look, if somebody can do it, then that means the road exists. There is a destination I can get to. So that's one of the things you can view as your comparison. Instead of, you know, getting bogged down in all the nitty gritty or telling myself something, making meaning out of that comparison, to say, oh, it's telling me that there's something that I really aspire to. That's what the comparison is trying to do for me. The second thing that comparison wants is it wants me to look at that person, see what they did, and figure out, is there something I can take away or learn that they have done, that if I just do that, I put it in quotes, just,
Yeah.
if I do that or do those things or learn from these people, the things that they have done that have led them to their achievements or their success, right? And that's interesting because that is potentially leaning closer to the use case for comparison. if I can just see what they did that's different or that helped propel them, then I can choose to do those things, and I'm more likely to accomplish or achieve. I can learn from those experiences and get more out of it. Now, does that make comparison sound terrible?
No.
Not if we're extracting those things. Now, that's a process. I'm not saying that it's easy to do. It takes intention, it takes time, it takes effort, and sometimes it takes some training. Dare I say, even potentially coaching. Because we don't learn to do this automatically. The comparison may show up, but if we're not sure, we don't know how to extract that out of it, then it can absolutely lead to making those upward comparisons, feeling worse about ourselves, not really learning anything, and then again, feeling like we are not as good, not as capable, or that we'll never get there.
So all this has been amazing. So just to recap, Yishai, if we are feeling imposter syndrome, what is the best way to approach it? Just in a sentence or two.
Yeah. So I'm going to give it, I'll call it the triple A. We'll give it the triple A treatment.
Okay.
And I'll use this analogy. If you get a flat tire, right, using triple A as the example, right? What do? Well, you got to stop the car. You got to figure out what the problem is. You got to make a plan, and then you got to go fix it and go do it. So here's the triple A. The first A is for awareness. You got to be aware. We are often making so many comparisons we're not even aware, and we're just feeling terrible about ourselves, or we can just be beating up on ourselves mentally, even emotionally. We can just, and we might be even making meetings. So the first thing to do is to slow down and become aware that this is happening. Naming it can help. And naming it imposter phenomenon might help move away from thinking that I have contracted some kind of, deathly disease or disorder, or, career ending or career threatening, right? Which is the way I think many people relate to it. So the first A in the triple A treatment, when your kind of mental car breaks down, is awareness. The second A is analysis. Conduct an analysis. And if it helps, listen back to this episode and rehash over the questions, the thought processes that we've been talking about, that I've been sharing, because without the analysis, it's going to be really hard to both pick apart and make sense of, and then also to formulate an action plan that's helpful, that will actually help propel you forward, and then to take that action, which is the third A, is action plan or action. Both really, maybe it's the quad A treatment, right? Got to make an action plan, and then you really got to follow through with action. So I kind of roll all of that up into the last A, action, right? So awareness, analysis, and action. That's an important, meaningful process to engage in. And in a nutshell, when you're feeling stuck in the imposter syndrome, at least that's a place to start. And it's also perhaps helpful to direct you to move forward.
Love all that. And I have to throw in here that if any of this resonates with anybody out there, Dr. Yishai dives into all kinds of topics like this on his podcast called The Business Couch with Dr. Yishai, and I highly recommend it. So 4 last questions, Yishai. First one.
Just one thing before we dive in, if that's okay.
Yes.
I also want to mention that in the research, there's a lot of research that also shows that sometimes imposter syndrome can show up with either depression or anxiety. And I want to be really real and share with you a couple of things. If you are experiencing some of that, it's really important to, at the very least, consider, if not explore, seeing a therapist. So if it gets really difficult, or if you're finding yourself unable to really make your way out of that, I really encourage you to do that. And then the second part of it, which I think is a disclaimer, is I may be a psychologist, but I'm not your psychologist. So the things that we've talked about today are really important to do your own research and or to speak with a professional, particularly a clinician, especially if you're experiencing a really debilitating experience. I just wanted to make sure that I throw that in, because I think it's really, really important.
It is. Thank you so much for that. So all the great advice that you gave us today, what's the best piece of advice you were ever given?
Best piece of advice I was ever given. You don't need to rush. Whatever it is that's your goal, it's a journey with obstacles and growth on the way.
Love that. Share with us one thing on your bucket list.
Do a TED Talk.
Any particular topic?
That's a great question. So I talk and think a lot about our emotion system, our limbic system, which I actually call our adaptive system. So, and I talk so much about that, and I would love to do a talk on that. I mean, I can go off on it right now, but in really brief, as it turns out, our habits and our emotion system are actually like two different muscles, like your bicep and tricep. They're both really important and necessary for movement and for us to function really well in life. And they also do two very opposite things. In order for each of them to be really useful, you need to also use the other in a very different way. So a lot of people talk a lot about habits. People don't talk as much about our emotion system and when and how and why it shows up. So I would love to do a TED Talk on all of that.
Well, I can't wait to hear it.
How that's adaptive. Yeah.
So when the toy companies finally get around to making an action figure of you, what two accessories will it come with?
I had a hard time because I have 3 of them.
You're an overachiever, Yishai, so give me 3.
I am such an overachiever. So a book, a model brain, and then a couch chair.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
And last one, how do people find you?
Great question. So I would really encourage you first to go to the Business Couch with Dr. Yishai, subscribe, listen to some episodes. If you like it, then you can subscribe. If you'd like to find me, I'm on LinkedIn as well under Dr. Yishai or Yishai Barkhordari, and also my website, dryishai.com, DRYISHAI.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm Marlana Semenza, photographer and visual strategist. Please comment, like, or share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. For more information on how I can help you create your iconic image, visit marlanasemenza.com.